Hello everyone and welcome to another video here on White Coats and Corgis. Today I'm going to be showing you a clip from the Premed Experience, which is a free virtual event that I hosted back in March of 2023. Alright, let's go ahead and get started.
All right, very good. Ziggy, is there a question here that you would like to take?
Let me see here. Let's see. Let's see here. Let me see. Okay. What are admission committees looking for in the secondary application to invite applicants for an interview? That's a great question. I mean, well, at the end of the day, what they're looking for is authenticity and granularity of response, basically. And the reason I say this is, not surprisingly, you know, I've looked at lots and lots of secondaries, and one of the most common problems that I see among them basically is a lot of the answers tend to be very generic, very general. They're really not personalized to the person writing the, doing the secondary, basically, giving more insight into that person, basically. And it's also oftentimes not personalized enough to the medical school itself, basically. Sometimes you can tell that someone is like copy and pasted a response and it's a very generic answer, basically. And now, to be fair, there's nothing wrong with doing that because there is a lot of overlap in questions, basically. And of course, you want to be as efficient and effective as possible. But that being said, even if it's a similar question, you really have to try to do a deeper dive in terms of really showing, you really want to, at the end of the day, this is the point, you really want to show the school that you are an ideal match for them, right? They're considering, thousands of applicants and then deciding who to interview, who to invest time, money, and effort into, right? So you can actually, it's under your control to make that extra effort to do the research about the school, to really think about the questions in great depth, and then within your response to provide as much granularity and personalization as you can. I think if you take that approach and also back up your whatever responses you have with as much sort of evidence, as I like to call it, instead of just having, generalizations, I think that's going to get you ahead of the game, quite frankly.
Excellent. And here I have a question that I think Ziggy and I are both going to be able to provide some input on. The student is asking about what major they should be selecting and how that might be strategic for the MCAT and also for medical school admission. So I'm happy to provide the MCAT side, which is for the MCAT, it covers a broad variety of subjects, right? Biology, general chemistry, organic chemistry, physiology, biochemistry, psychology, and sociology. There's no way you're going to take on 10 majors, right? So in practice, there's not a single major that's going to help you get a perfect score in the MCAT, right? I always tell students that each of you have your own strength as a student, right? So if you're a biology major, you're probably going to do great on the bio-chem section. If you're a physics major, then you're probably going to do really well in the chem-phys section. This also applies for those students who aren't even majoring in the sciences. So if you're majoring in the social studies, if you're interested in music or economics or comparative literature, you've got advantages of your own, and that typically manifests in the car section that you don't have to do anything to prep for that section. You're getting a great car score. So in terms of the major for the MCAT, really any major would work, but I'm interested to see what Ziggy thinks about majors for medical school applications.
Yes, absolutely. And this is a question that I'm, asked a lot, what should I be majoring in to sort of gain a competitive edge to getting into medical school or to doing better on my MCAT or whatever, something like that, basically. And the answer is that's not the way you should be asking the question, basically. In terms of a major, the one answer I've been giving for years and years and years is you should pick whatever you're passionate about, whatever you're interested in. If you are, I had a client before who was a theater major, got into medical school, right? college is one of the few times in your life where you get to do things that you really enjoy doing before you're kind of forced to do it, basically. And you should really take advantage of that to explore. I was a psychology major, but whether it's theater, English, sociology, I mean, if you happen to love science and want to, double or triple major in a science, wow, that's congratulations. And, you should do it basically, but don't try to do it because you want to get a competitive edge or because you think it's going to help you study for the MCAT. I think Ken would agree that's not really a great reason to choose any major for any kind of test, basically. So I think that's the approach that I would utilize. And I think if you sort of take the approach that I'm talking about, you're going to have a much more fulfilling and memorable college experience, to say the least, basically. All right, let's see. Did you want to ask me one, or do you want me to find one to ask myself?
Sure, I'll take a look. So I saw a question here that I thought was really good. And the reason was because I can certainly relate to this. For my undergraduate studies, I went to UC Berkeley, which is a large public school. Our general chemistry class, Chem 1A, had 1,500 students. So they had 3 lectures, 9 a.m., 11 a.m., 1 p.m., 500 students each. And the student is asking, how do you build relationships with professors through college? And ultimately, how can this lead to a recommendation letter?
Yeah, oh, that's such a great question. And that's sort of just like, an issue that everybody struggles with every year, especially as Ken mentioned, when you're in a very large class or you're a non-science major and you're trying to look for a science professor. Basically, you feel like your options are limited. And it does, here's the thing, when you were in high school, a lot of the times things are sort of handed to you on a silver platter, basically, and you don't have to make that effort to reach out, make connections, network, and all that kind of stuff. Once you get to college, it's a whole different ballgame, in general. You're the one who has to be very proactive. You cannot be waiting for professors to come to you or make an effort with you. They've got a million other more important things to do, quite frankly. So in terms of developing a relationship, with the ultimate goal of, maybe gaining a good experience with them or getting a letter of recommendation, there's a few things that I recommend, doing, basically. Number one, for any class that you're taking, well, of course, try to get the best grade possible. That's one of the most important things, basically. Do well in the class. Second of all, a lot of times these classes, even large, small, whatever, they often have review sessions before every, exam or a final or a midterm or something like that. I remember when I took like my calculus class, I used to go to every single review session, even if I understood the material well. I mean, sometimes you learn new things in the review sessions, but from a strategic sort of networking perspective, I think that's a great time to come with, prepared, genuine questions that you really want to ask, that you really care about asking. And that's a great time to ask such questions, ask such questions. Another thing, of course, is that, as we all know, our professors have office hours, basically, right? And so that is something you want to take advantage of appropriately. And what I mean by that is, you don't want to just, try to build a relationship by dropping by anytime and just chit-chatting and doing all that stuff. That is a very poor use and kind of a disrespectful use of the professor's time. You have to go there with a purpose, basically, something that you genuinely, again, I know I keep saying the word genuine, but sometimes people come up, go for disingenuous reasons. And I feel like seasoned professors and even human beings can see through that, basically. So you want to go with genuine questions. If you're struggling with something or you really want to know about something, yeah, take advantage of those office hours to have a sit down or even set up a special meeting outside of the office hours if you feel like it's going to necessitate, more time, basically. And then I think one of the other the third way that you can really develop a relationship with a professor is, again, if you're doing really well in the class, to consider being a TA for the class. That's a great opportunity where you can demonstrate, how proactive you are, your knowledge, your skills as it relates to the class, your leadership ability as it relates to dealing with other students, basically. And oftentimes some of the richest, the best quality letters of recommendation can come from that, because they're able to observe you and really detail the things that you've that you've done, basically. So that would be my recommendation for building relationships, basically.
Fantastic. And I think maybe we can switch gears a little bit. I saw this other question that I think is a good one that students are always thinking about. I mentioned earlier, when it comes to applying to medical school, they're often going to look at your GPA and MCAT. And if your GPA is a little bit lower, students are always trying to get a higher MCAT score to make up for it. But another path that a lot of students will look into would be taking more classes. So this student is asking about postbac programs or master's programs. So Ziggy, perhaps you can give your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. That often, what Ken was saying about sort of the postbac program, often relates to applicants who have a weak GPA, basically. Sometimes you have, there are people for whatever reason struggled in undergrad, and maybe their total science GPA is, only around the 3.0 range or even a little bit lower, basically. And in cases like that, you definitely want to consider, of course, there are other factors to look into, but you definitely want to consider a postbac program. Sometimes it can be related at the undergrad level, and sometimes there are what's called SMP programs, special master's programs. And the benefit of taking a master's program is that the GPA that you get there is calculated separately from your undergraduate GPA, because sometimes it can be a lot harder to raise it if you're only focused on the undergrad GPA, and especially true for people who have majored in a science, basically, because that's the majority of your courses. So if you take an SMP, that's separate. Now, so that is definitely, if your GPA is really low, basically, and you feel like there's no other way that you can, demonstrate your qualifications, definitely consider that. But, and the other positive thing is, oftentimes such programs support you in other ways too, maybe with other experiences, even sometimes MCAT support. So that's something to consider too. Now, on the flip side of that, though, is if you do such a program, you really have to make sure that you get like a top GPA there, basically, because if you take that, if you do this SMP and then your GPA is not very good, that really kind of sinks the whole ship. It really demonstrates to the admissions committee that you cannot handle, or you're having a difficult time handling the rigors of a medical school curriculum, basically, given that a lot of these SMP programs integrate a lot of those same courses. So you really want to make sure that, if you're going to take such a program, that you do sort of this self-analysis, especially as it relates to your pre-med courses of, what did I do wrong? What were my weaknesses? What do I need to do to rectify that so I don't make the same mistakes later on when I do this post-bac program? I think that's very critical to do.
Completely agree. And just speaking from experience working with some students that have been in post-bac programs or SMP programs, while studying for the MCAT, it can be pretty intense, right? For some of these programs, they have the students take the same classes as the first year medical students affiliated with that program. So it's really to try to show that these students, if they can do well in first year medical school classes, they would be good candidates for really any medical school. And something that's quite challenging for a lot of these students is, whether it's a 1-year program or 2-year program, at some point during these programs, they're going to have to study for the MCAT at the same time. So, if you think it's tough with your undergraduate courses with the MCAT, I guarantee with medical school classes and MCAT, it's a lot more work.
Yes, definitely. Definitely.
All right. So let me, I saw this other question that I think would be great for you to take on. So the student was saying, when you're applying to medical school, is it bad to express that there's a specialty that you're already interested in, right? So the student was saying that they're really interested in pathology. Is it bad for them to say in a personal statement that they want to become a pathologist?
Yeah, no, that is a really great question, and a lot of people ask it. And for me, at least in terms of how I approach it with my clients, I say no. I've had a lot of clients who, by the time they were applying, have a strong sense of what they want to do, and they have very specific reasons why. I'm working with a client who knows he's interested in pediatric oncology because he himself was a patient in pediatric oncology, and not surprisingly, that had a formidable impact on him, basically. So no, I don't think there's anything wrong with include, if you want that to sort of be the theme of your personal statement. Now, the important thing, and this is true for anything, for whatever you say in your personal statement, like, I'm passionate about medicine because I want to be a pathologist, or I want to work with low socioeconomic people, or I care about medical technology, whatever it is that you're saying, declaring about your interests, one of the most important things you need to make sure is that you can back it up, basically, that within the body of your personal statement, you have a relevant experience where you're demonstrating that you've had that experience in depth, basically, so they know that you're not just saying that, but that you're really proving it. Because it would be really strange to be like, I'm so passionate about medicine because I want to be a pediatrician, and there's nothing in your whole personal statement about having worked with kids in any way, shape, or form, basically. Now, medical schools also understand that you might say on your personal statement, I want to be a pathologist, but that later on during medical school, you might change your mind. You might realize, oh, you stumble upon you do clinical rounds and you find another field that is of more interest to you. And medical schools understand that too. The main thing is, for whatever you declare, you always want to be genuine and be able to make sure that you can back up what you say. You don't want to just say things because, again, it looks like it's going to give you some kind of strategic advantage, or picking a specialty that maybe nobody else has ever thought of, basically, because it'll make you sound more unique. Those are not the right ways to sort of strategize as you work on your personal statement, or I would say any part of your application, basically. Ken, I saw a question, if you don't mind my answering. It was about, why do I suggest for leadership experience, basically. So if you don't mind, I thought I might talk about that a little bit, basically. And of course, if you have any thoughts, because you're a leader in your own way too, it would be great to hear that. But, in terms of leadership experience, back during the webinar that I was on with Dr. Marinelli, she had noted, the 4 activities that you have to do: community service, research, clinical experience, shadowing. And then the 5th thing she had written was leadership, right? And, leadership is not it's an activity, but it's sort of a quality that you want to demonstrate that can be, experienced in any of those 4 activities that medical schools want to see. So in terms of demonstrating leadership. So let's think about it this way. There's kind of a spectrum, basically, right? When we think of leadership, one of the most common ways that we know about leadership is when someone is part of a club or an organization, and you see like, oh, they were the vice president of a club, they were the secretary or the treasurer or the president, basically. So that in and of itself, just because of the innate nature of what those terms mean, we know that means that they have a leadership position, basically. But what I would argue, and I hopefully it gets to the heart of this question, is that there are many other ways that you can demonstrate leadership experience, whether it's through clinical experience, volunteering, research. Shadowing is a little bit harder, I'm going to be honest, basically. But sometimes what it entails is showing initiative, maybe proposing a project, following through with it, and getting results, basically. And an example that I can use of leadership in a very non-conventional sense is, I had a client who was volunteering in the emergency room. And I think one of the things I had said earlier in the webinar is, although volunteering in a hospital is great, a lot of people do it. And so it's a little bit harder to differentiate yourself, basically. So if you can do that, that's great. So for this student, he was like, oh, I'm an ER volunteer. I was like, oh, okay, great. And then we were talking about it a little bit more. And then he happened to mention, oh, and by the way, one of my responsibilities is that I'm responsible for training all the new volunteers, basically, who volunteer in the ER. And that sort of led to like an aha moment, where we then had this little brainstorming session, and he came up with the idea of creating like a training manual for all the new volunteers that were going to come in, so it would make it easier for them once they started, basically. And so that idea kind of took hold. He worked on it, was able to present it to the chair of the emergency department, and then I think at that point there was COVID, so it kind of put a little bit of the kibosh on it. But the point is, that shows with a little bit of outside of the box thinking, perseverance, that there are a lot of ways that you can demonstrate leadership. So what I would say is, for whatever experience that you're doing, of course, don't just like come in guns blazing and say like, hey, we need to do all this stuff. You kind of have to sit back, listen, observe, see what's going on, see where there might be a need for improvement. And then, in a very sort of methodical and thoughtful way, come up with a proposal and talk to the appropriate person about how you might do that.
Nice. And Ziggy, someone just asking if you could repeat again what was the list of the different types of experiences earlier?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are 4 main experiences that medical schools care about. Number 1 is clinical experience. And clinical experience means that you are interacting with patients in some way, shape, or form, basically. One of the most common ways is through hospital volunteering, where you're greeting people as they come into the hospital. You might be transporting patients, bringing patients blankets, basically. Like I said before, that's a very, very common way. The other kinds of experiences that we often recommend doing to get sort of more in-depth level of responsibility and interaction with patients is scribing, EMT, hospice volunteer, even clinical research. So that's clinical experience. Number 2 is shadowing. And as the term, as the word implies, you're shadowing somebody. It's a much more passive sort of activity where you're following a physician, around as they sort of go meet the patients or whatever it is they're doing. You're kind of like a fly on the wall, basically. So shadowing is important for a few reasons, right? Medical schools want to see that you've taken the time as a future physician to understand the different types of specialties that are out there, basically, because they're not all the same. My background is psychiatry, and my dad background, he's a pathologist, and I can assure you those are 2 very different days, basically. So you want to kind of see what a day in the life looks like for different kinds of specialty, and also for your own edification, basically. If you're interested in neurology, you should try to shadow a neurologist, basically. That's only going to provide you helpful, you'll gain insight into that, basically. So that's shadowing. Number 3, research, as it implies. Whether it's a wet lab or clinical research, even in the humanities, if you're doing psychology research, sociology research, that's really great. We recommend that you try to do at least 2 years, try to get a middle author publication if possible, presentation. A quick corollary to this, which I talked about before, is clients often ask me, if I have no interest whatsoever in being a researcher later, do I need to do it? Yes, that's the short answer. Unfortunately, I'm sorry. And as someone who doesn't like research, I really empathize with you. But this is one of those things where even if you don't want to do research, medical schools still want to see that you've had the experience of having done research. So, if you do a little bit, maybe through a class, sometimes there's ways to do research. It's not like you have to do all these, tons of publications and all of that kind of stuff. I think that's good. It's a little bit easier to explain, if you don't do as much research. That just means that later on, when you apply to medical schools, you need to be more strategic about the medical schools you apply to. So you're not going to apply to the super research oriented medical schools like the Harvards, Hopkins, UPenns of the world, but maybe focus more on primary care research-oriented medical schools, like UNC, University of Washington, which, to be fair, they also do a lot of amazing research, but their clinical research is more primary care oriented. And then the last thing, excuse me, the 4th thing is community service. So just to make sure we understand, community service is, demonstrating altruism. It's giving of your time without getting anything back, basically, like in terms of payment or anything like that, basically. So volunteering, basically. So of course, you can do that through healthcare. A lot of people do like Habitat for Humanity, working in soup kitchens, food shelters. Those are great ways to demonstrate altruism. Those are the 4 main things. The 5th thing, which I'll mention, I just say this so you don't forget, because oftentimes a lot of clients end up writing about this on their work activity section, is hobbies, basically. So I'm not saying you should take up a new hobby in college just for the sake of putting it on your application, but most hobbies usually occur prior to college, basically. And so if you have a hobby that you started in high school, junior high, and want to carry it on through college, that's like a great thing to, continue, just application aside, just for your mental sanity, quite frankly. That's a good thing to do. And then you can write about it. I had a client, sorry, who one of her hobbies, she was from Minnesota, so not surprising, her hobby was like knitting mittens, basically. And she was a little bit wary about putting that on her application because she thought it sounded a little strange. And I was like, no, you have to put it on there. Like, you have to talk about why you're knitting these mittens. Well, it's Minnesota. Okay, I know why she was knitting them. What you're doing with the mittens and all that kind of stuff. So she did put it on there, and then ironically ended up going to Stanford, very warm weather. I'm not saying the mittens got her into Stanford, but I think it's something that helps differentiate you, basically. So probably more than you wanted to hear about all these experiences, but yeah, that's my take.
Absolutely. I had to say, I had to chuckle a little earlier when you were talking about the students who don't want to become researchers, but they just have to do the research. The thing that I do want to comment on that, and having focused on research, right? I completed my PhD in neuroscience. Is that not all research experiences are the same, right? So what I mean by that is your experience in research will very much depend on the mentor that you're working with.
Mhm.
And what I mean by that is there's some mentors who are good mentors, whereas there are other mentors who look at pre-med students pretty much as free labor, right? So if you're working in a lab and they're pretty much just having you do the work of a technician, right? So if all you're doing is washing test tubes, or if all you're doing is, like separating mice, right? Like if you're doing the very same kind of busy work every day, then that's not necessarily the best research experience, right? There's some mentors who essentially just think of pre-medical students that way. You're just doing, manual labor for them. But there's a lot of other mentors that are really good that really want to explain to you what you're actually doing, right? They want to explain to you the scientific question that they're interested in, and how the experiments that you're helping with can actually help to answer those questions. So sort of because of that, it doesn't really matter what field of research you're doing research in, because what they all have in common is you're answering questions that nobody in the world has answers to. The point of research is to gain new knowledge about the world.
Oh, that's great. I wish I had heard this little talk before I was in college. I would have had a different trajectory back there. Anyway, no, that's really awesome. Thank you for that great advice. And I saw a great question on here, Ken, that I wanted to ask you. Hold on, let me just find it. Okay, hold on. So here's the question, Ken, and maybe we can even extrapolate from it a little bit. So the question is, do you know the best resources for learning and practicing biochemistry for the MCAT? I take the MCAT in September 2023, and I was not able to take the course yet, but I think that's a great question just in terms of resources in general. And if you don't mind my adding, sometimes, let's be honest, sometimes people can't afford to take all these courses or hire tutors and all that. And for those people, I'm not saying this person is in that situation, but for people who might be in that situation where budget is of a concern, if you have any thoughts about that, that would be helpful too.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we've already discussed a lot of what you have to do as a pre-medical student, right? There's so much that you have to do in terms of classes, experiences, MCAT and such, but there's also a lot of costs associated with, the process of becoming a physician. The MCAT, for example, it costs $300 just to take the MCAT. Now, the AMC does offer what is called a fee assistance program. So for those with financial need, it's possible for you to take the MCAT for free and also pay lower costs for applying to medical school. So that is something that you should consider looking into if you are in need of help with finances. When it comes to preparation for the MCAT, there are so many different resources. I will say the most important thing is you have to use some resources. The MCAT is not like the SAT or the ACT. You can't just take the MCAT blind and just say, oh, I took these classes in college. I learned these science content. I got A's in these classes. I'm going to be fine with the MCAT. That's not how it works. The MCAT is going to test a lot of science content that you didn't learn in your college courses. And similarly, there's a lot of science content in your college courses that won't be tested on the MCAT. And that's because the curricula of your college courses doesn't match that of the MCAT. So you really do need to use resources that are specific to the MCAT for your preparation. And in terms of these resources, I would say there's essentially different tiers of resources, right? The first is actually what most students do for the MCAT, which is they use a DIY approach, right? Essentially, they purchase all of the resources they need. So that would be a set of MCAT books, as well as practice questions, right? And for these resources, they're typically lower cost, right? Especially when it comes to MCAT books. You can purchase a new set of books on Amazon for a couple $100, or you can purchase a previous edition for a small fraction of the cost. And practice exams, again, it's not too different in terms of the amount that you typically have to pay for a question bank. The other thing to realize is there are a lot of free resources out there. One of them that I'll certainly highlight is Khan Academy. So Khan Academy, if you haven't heard about, it's actually not just for the MCAT. Khan Academy has videos covering just about every subject out there. So if you're struggling in your organic chemistry class, you can check out the Khan Academy organic chemistry video lectures. They're quite good. So Khan Academy has videos covering the science content on the MCAT. They also have practice questions. Those are all free. The AMC also has a number of free practice exams and practice questions you can utilize as well. And that's typically what a lot of students would look to gather as resources. But there's also other resources that students will often turn to. So all of you right now are here at this free event, the Premed Experience, right? So you're always going to find a lot of events where people are happy to share their knowledge and expertise with pre-medical students. And if it's not at a live event like this, you can simply just go to YouTube. If you go to YouTube and type in the search bar, biochemistry, metabolic pathways, biochemistry, gluconeogenesis, you can find dozens of videos on every science concept that is tested on the MCAT. So there's a surplus of resources out there for MCAT preparation. Now, for a lot of students, they're happy with this approach. They can get everything they need from what is readily available. There are some students who, instead of having to find all of these different resources on their own, they simply just wanted to have all of them in one location. So that's why a lot of students will choose to sign up for a prep course, right? So you can sign up for an MCAT course, and these are typically in the order of a couple $1,000. So it's definitely more expensive than MCAT books and question banks. But in these cases, you attend a class, you've got an MCAT expert, they explain the key science concepts you need, and they also give you a bundle of resources as well. An MCAT class tends to be more passive, right? You're in a class with 30 students, and especially if you're taking an online class, you're typically just sitting there and you're being lectured to, right? The instructor's just talking to you, whereas when you're doing one-on-one tutoring, it's very interactive. It's back and forth conversations. Your tutor is explaining the science concepts to you, but they're also asking you questions to check your comprehension. And you're also able to ask questions when there's something you don't understand. So because of that, we view MCAT tutoring really as being the most effective way for helping students to prepare for the exam. But hopefully that gives you a sense of, the different levels of cost when it comes to preparing for the MCAT. And there was one question that I wanted to answer here because I saw it in the chat for some time. So the question was non-traditional students, which I don't think we've touched on. So I think there's probably perspectives that we can address for both. I'm happy to talk about the MCAT aspect, and Ziggy, I'm sure you can talk about the application aspect. So the MCAT aspect is, this is a student that is working full-time. They took the MCAT in 2014. They got a competitive score. They have to retake the MCAT, and they want suggestions on how to do this, such as a part-time job. And the advising part is essentially how do they present themselves as a non-traditional student compared to younger students. So I'll take the MCAT part first, which is number one, if you've already taken the MCAT before and gotten a competitive score, that's fantastic. Because if you've already taken the MCAT before and gotten a good score, that's a very, very good indication that you're going to be able to retake the MCAT and get a good score again, right? Often good test takers don't really lose that skill. So you'll be able to retake the exam, be able to get a good score. But of course, it is true that if the last time you took the MCAT was in 2014, you've probably forgotten a lot of science content. It's been 8 years. So indeed, you do need to find time to be able to focus on the MCAT. Now, I have worked with a lot of students who work full time while studying for the MCAT. It can be done, but it's going to be tough because you have to think about it. You got to wake up in the morning, you got to commute to work, you've got to go to work, you got to commute home, you've got, to shower, to eat dinner and such, right? By the time you're done with your day, you might already be pretty tired. How much more studying can you still get done, right? I hear students tell me, oh, I can come home, I'm going to do 3 to 4 hours of studying on weekdays and 8 to 10 hours on weekends. That almost never happens, right? Like more realistic is you might do 1 to 2 hours on weekdays and 6 to 8 hours on weekends at most. So you have to decide if you're okay doing that, working full time and studying in your spare time, then you can make that happen. But for a lot of people who are non-traditional students, because they have other life obligations they have to deal with, that spare time on the side really ends up just being a few hours each week, which is not enough time. So if that's your situation where you're not going to be able to find enough hours in the week to study, then I would absolutely agree with your recommendation of switching to a part-time job, right? Instead of working 5 days a week, can you work 2 to 3 days a week? Or can you work, can you cut your hours, right? If you're able to have more open time, then that would definitely make it easier for you to study for the MCAT. And I'll ask Ziggy to handle the application.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Yeah, and so just so the audience knows, we have about 4 more minutes left, basically. So I want to be mindful of that. But so we're getting to the end, basically. So in terms of non-traditional applicants, I touched upon this a little in the webinar, and it's such a great question. First of all, being a non-traditional applicant doesn't put you at a disadvantage. I think one of the things you want to do as a non-traditional applicant is sort of do a self-analysis of your prior career, background, and think about the knowledge and skills from there that are applicable as a future medical student and physician. And that's something you want to think of a way to try to package later on when you're working on your application in terms of the personal statement, secondaries later on, presenting yourself in interviews. Now, the one area that if you're like a career changer or something like that, the one area as a non-traditional applicant, the one area that you really want to be mindful of as you work on your application and think about how you present yourself is on the personal statement, right? And so one of the things that you really want to sort of have a neon light about is really detailing why you are making the switch from whatever career you had before to wanting to become a physician. And I would argue this is also relevant to people who are in the healthcare field. I have some clients who were like a nurse before and they want to become a physician now. Well, they're both amazing types of healthcare providers, right? So it's incumbent on you to detail why becoming a physician specifically is so important to you and in your life, basically. And I think if you can get that across in an authentic way that's backed with evidence to show that you've done due diligence on understanding what the life of a physician entails, basically, and then combining that with sort of the unique knowledge and skills that you might have gained from your prior career, I think that's a great way. I had a client, I think I did a mock interview with her. She had done stand-up comedy in New York City, which I thought was just amazing. But I can imagine, applying some skills from there to being a physician later, basically. So my point is, don't short shrift, any of the experiences that you might have had before in your life as you sort of look to move forward and become a physician later on.